Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. This episode of the New Stack Makers is sponsored by KubeCon CloudNativeCon. KubeCon CloudNativeCon conferences gather adopters and technologists to further the education and advancement of cloud-native computing. The vendor-neutral events feature domain experts and key maintainers behind popular projects such as Kubernetes, Prometheus, gRPC, Envoy, and more. The KubeCon Seattle event is coming right up, December 10th through 13th. It is sold out. You can still get on the waiting list. Registration will open soon for their 2019 events. Be sure to register early for KubeCon Barcelona, May 20th through 23rd. KubeCon Shanghai, June 24th through 26th, and KubeCon San Diego, November 18th through 21. Hope to see you there. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at KubeCon CloudNativeCon in China, the first KubeCon CloudNativeCon event in China. We're in Shanghai, and it's great to have Brendan Burns, Distinguished Engineer at Microsoft, joining us, who's the founder, one of the founders of Kubernetes, who must be thinking, gosh, here we are in China, look how far this project has come.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. We're about 5 years to the day from when the idea sort of crystallized with Joe and Craig and I, I don't think we could have ever imagined that this would be where we'd be sitting 5 years
Did you know
later.
them before that?
Yeah, I mean, we'd worked together.
Because you came from the advertising?
No, I was in web search.
You're in web, okay.
And they were in cloud. Joe had been in chat before and then was in cloud before I was in cloud. And Craig had started in cloud. And I knew them because I was doing sort of configuration management, like Chef Puppet style stuff before the container work. And Joe was working on VMs, and so we were figuring out, how do we configure the VMs, and really running into a lot of problems, honestly, because running scripts to configure a VM is error prone, and so we'd been talking a lot about where we needed to go. And then when we both sort of saw Docker come out, that was sort of when we really kind of crystallized. Joe was kind of done doing VMs, and I was ready to do something new, and that was when it really crystallized, and with Craig to sort of lead it out.
So here we are today, and the development of Kubernetes has now moved much deeper into the enterprise. And we saw today in the keynote the number of certified solutions providers out there, and there's 69 of them. And then the end users, the end user list is filling up the slide now with all the logos. So policy now becomes an important issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's really important for a lot of these enterprises. They're honestly a little nervous about handing over the keys to a cluster to developers, and so ensuring that there are the right kind of guardrails to give people flexibility to deploy whatever they want, but within the constraints of a compliance regime or a security regime that is centralized inside the company. And so what we're seeing is the evolution of these kinds of policy controls. So Azure has been working on an open source project in conjunction with the Kubernetes authentication and authorization SIG-auth, to develop a policy controller. And basically the policy controller allows enterprises to easily specify rules about how a user is going to use Kubernetes. So it might be something like you can only pull images from this private registry that we trust. Right? That ensures that you don't pull random images from the internet, you only pull images from a specific place. Or it might be sort of more around reliability, you can only deploy something if there's at least 3 replicas of it, right? You can't deploy singletons. Or it might be metadata, an annotation that provides the contact email for a particular component so that if it's misbehaving or if somebody needs to know, if it should still exist, somebody has a contact place to go and find out, this is the team that created this component. Or even something like a TTL. So one of the things we've found, actually, even with our own infrastructure, is developers will put something up into the cluster, and they'll give it a name like, my test 2 or something like that. And for 2 or 3 days, they'll use it, and they'll remember what it is. And then a month later, they won't even remember that they've created it. And you'll have all these things in the cluster with these names that aren't really attributable to any particular user or any particular usage, and you just don't know, like, is it still doing something important? Is it a soak test, or is it a unit test? Like, and when should it be deleted? And so you end up with these clusters that are just kind of full of crap.
They just, yeah, so the clusters just kind of grow and grow.
Right, and so you want to be able to say, you know what, our policy is, when you create something, you have to put a time to live on it. And then we can build automation that goes through and says, oh, your time to live has expired, we're going to delete you. And so policy can enforce that kind of stuff. Policy can say, you know, you have to put this specific annotation or this series of annotations onto these objects. So you can have some consistency. And so we've learned a lot. Azure as a cloud also has this policy for all of the objects, for VMs and everything else you create in Azure. We've learned a lot over the last couple of years of building that.
What have you learned?
Well, just sort of stuff around that you can't just have rules. You actually kind of need to have like rule sets. So like we first built just the infrastructure for writing rules. But what you find, like, you know, this field needs to have this value, this needs to be greater than that, whatever it happens to be. But what you find is actually people are putting these together into like either my IT rule set or even like something like HIPAA. Right? It's like you need to be compliant with this regulation, and if you apply this policy, then you will be compliant. And so we found that building out those sets, almost templates of rules, enabled teams to really quickly and easily become HIPAA compliant, or because they could just take a sort of off-the-shelf set of policies, apply it to their infrastructure, and suddenly know that, like, they're accounting for images, they're running security scanning, whatever the various compliance is. That was one really important learning. And then the other important learning is that you realize that in these enterprise environments, there's not one owner. There's like, you know, hey, we're going to contract out to this service provider to do network management, and we're going to contract out to this service provider to do app security, and this, you know, maybe internal IT is going to do part of it. And so having sort of clear lines of ownership and enabling that kind of collaboration is also really important. There isn't just sort of one resource owner. It's always fascinating to sort of peel the onion of the enterprise. You know, it's been sort of, you know, my last 2 years at Microsoft have been sort of doing a lot of that, peeling the onion.
How much does it come down to almost like, you know, having almost an audit of the internal environment itself?
Yeah, I mean that's part of it too. Definitely is policy actually can be used in multiple modes. So you can put policy into an enforcement mode where it will actually reject. It'll say, you know, you violated policy, you can't submit that. But you can also put it into an audit mode where it says, you know, hey, I'll let you do it, but I'm going to fire an alert into some queue that somebody's going to come along and say, okay, why? Why did you, you know, violate that particular policy? And that's valuable. Oftentimes that's valuable when people are rolling things out, because one of the things people find is they roll out this policy and then suddenly they break some CI/CD system. Right? And so they actually kind of need to, it's almost like they need to smoke test the policy first. Right? They need to, just like any other deployment, they need to deploy the policy in a mode where they get some signal. Like, how many users are we going to break if we deploy this policy? And audit logs can provide that kind of information. Okay,
so the number of dynamics kind of fit into kind of why this is needed. So, what have been the technical, you know, implementations that you've had to think through to develop this policy environment?
Well, I think some of it is like clear errors, right? Like, because ultimately, someone's going to push in one of these policies. The user is going to try and do something, may not even be aware that the policy is there. It's going to get rejected, and they're going to need to know why, right? And so if you just say something like bad request, they don't know, like, is it, you know, did I submit a bad object to Kubernetes? Or is it the policy? You know, or which policy? Like, and that rapidly can make someone be very, very frustrated.
That requires a real then breakdown, and like that takes time.
Yeah, it's almost like a compiler error actually. It's like this line in this file violates this policy. Right? It's like linting or any other one of these. You know, there's a lot of these kinds of tools that we build over time in software development, and that kind of error response is one of the most critical pieces. And I think the other piece that's really important is that sort of templating or sharing, right? Because somebody's going to have 20 different clusters or however many different clusters. They really want to write policy once and apply it to all of their clusters. They don't want to have each cluster be a slightly different environment. It's the irony is we spent all this time talking about immutable infrastructure and the value of immutable infrastructure, and sometimes you get into situations where you look at people's Kubernetes clusters, they're doing immutable infrastructure for their app, but the cluster's a snowflake, right? Like the cluster itself has this operator installed and this policy installed, and there's no accounting for how it got installed, and if they create a new cluster, people don't remember all the pieces that they put into the new cluster. So part of it is also providing templating and the ability to use things like Helm to apply your policy to multiple clusters.
Okay, so that's a good point about the application differences between the cluster, and the cluster can actually have a lot of issues that lead to problems, and that I think gets back to what you're talking about, craft, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing, right? Like you want consistency, and policy is a mechanism by which you can achieve consistency.
So what are the abstractions that you've needed to think through to be able to clean up these clusters and make that developer experience just better?
Well, I think part of it is figuring out a rule language that allows people to specify, like, how do you write a rule that says this this field in this object needs to have this value. That needs to be something that people can express, and express it declaratively. Express it in another in another JSON object so that you can reason about it. But then also give people recipes by which they can easily do that, right? Because if I'm an operator and all I really want to do is block you from pulling images from a particular registry, I don't want to have to figure out your weird JSON rule language. I just want to say, take this off-the-shelf rule, parameterize it with my container registry, and apply it to my cluster.
Right.
Right. And I think that is, again, where all these objects ultimately become custom resources in Kubernetes. Because they're custom resources in Kubernetes, tooling like Helm can apply. So you can say, hey, I'm going to take the Helm template for a policy object, and I'm going to parameterize it with my parameters and deploy it just like I would deploy MySQL using Helm or anything else. So I think that's the interesting thing, is like deploying policy looks almost exactly like deploying an off-the-shelf application.
Tell us more about Helm.
Sure.
And its integration, and maybe for people who are not familiar with it, describe what it is.
Yeah, so Helm is I would say at this point, the package manager for Kubernetes. And I think everybody at this point is familiar with package managers on their local machine, whether it's apt or brew on a Mac or something like Chocolatey on a Windows machine. They're tools that make it really easy for you to install specific pieces of software. But in that context, they're for single machines, right? Install this software onto this machine. What makes Helm different is its target is distributed systems on Kubernetes, right? And so you can say something like, I want to deploy or install Mongo. And when you install Mongo, you're going to install 3 different replicas in 3 different containers. It's going to create a load balancer. It's going to create all of the objects in Kubernetes necessary to deploy that distributed system. So Helm is a way of basically easily installing off-the-shelf software into a Kubernetes cluster. It's also, you can use it for deploying your own applications. So you can take, if you're deploying an application into multiple clusters, usually you want to parameterize it so that you can have the definition be largely the same, but maybe there's a little tweak, like in Europe, there's a certain number of replicas. In Asia, there's a different number of replicas. In the United States, there's yet another set of replicas. That's a parameter that is then applied to the Helm template to create a deployment into the cluster. But all the configuration information, the image you're using, all the flags, they stay the same. And that means like you don't have drift. When we were talking earlier about drift and cruft, you don't have drift between your different clusters. You have one place where you make changes, and then it gets applied to all the different clusters that you're running.
That's the role of the template.
Yeah, that's why you use a template. And these things have existed for Chef and Puppet and Ansible and Salt. I mean, like the pattern has been existed in cloud for a really long time. Helm really is, its purpose was to bring it to Kubernetes. You're really excited actually that recently it actually moved out from being a Kubernetes sub-project to being a incubator project of its own right within the CNCF. And so really excited to see the Helm team, a lot of the people from Microsoft who are the primary contributors to Helm, did some great work to get it to be into a place where it really should be considered a first-order project within the CNCF.
You talked about the role of programming languages here, right? And thinking through like how there needs to be new programming languages for these data pipeline, these policy environments.
Yeah.
We are starting to see that trend emerge. We're seeing Chef and Spec, for example, do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is of all of these sort of configuration languages, they kind of inevitably become Turing complete.
Right? They become what?
Turing complete,
yeah.
like a first order
yeah.
programming language, but they're bad programming languages because they sort of back their way in. People don't sit down and think, oh, I'm going to design a programming language. They say, oh, I'm going to start with this YAML file, and then somebody says, geez, I really wish you had string concatenation. And they hack together some way of doing string concatenation. And they say, you know what, I'd really like to have conditionals. And they add, conditionals in. And pretty soon you have a full-on programming language, but you weren't a programming language designer and you weren't, thinking about that when you were building it. You're just satisfying a bunch of feature requests effectively. And I think what we're coming to a realization is that it's just better to start with a real programming language. The tooling is better. So I'd like to, one of the examples I like to say is that, Terraform is probably the best in terms of like IDE integration and tooling and like, it's probably the best. And it's probably not as good as, programming language number 10 on the list of most popular programming languages, right? Like, there's just so much more tooling for unit testing, for syntax highlighting, for code review, linting. Like, there's all this tooling around programming languages that it's obvious that it applies to config too, and it's like, why reinvent that wheel? And I think it's something that sort of historically people have had kind of a gut reaction against, but I think we're realizing actually that with DevOps and things like that, like really it just makes sense to have everybody use program. It doesn't have to be the same program or even the same programming language, but writing your configuration in a real programming language just makes more sense, I think, anyway.
So tell me then about the group that's building the policy engine right now that we're discussing. Yeah,
so I mean, there's an open source sort of way of specifying policies called the OPA spec, Open Policy Agent, I think. It's Open Policy is definitely the first two. I always have trouble with these acronyms. Yeah. So that's independent, and we're using that language for specifying the rule sets. And then we started building it because we had so many enterprise users within Azure who were asking for it. We needed to go build it. And then we posted it up, and with the beauty of open source, we posted up a GitHub project and a video of it in action, and we immediately got a bunch of interest from other people who wanted to collaborate. And so we're moving it out of being in an Azure-specific repository to being, because it's not specific to Azure, it's just we had that GitHub repo. We're moving it into a Kubernetes repository, and I think we're going to collaborate there as a sub-project of SIG-Auth. To work together to build up this controller for Kubernetes anywhere. Who's in
the group?
So
some of the leaders.
The couple people from my team are the people who sort of started it out, and there's a bunch of the other members of SIG-Auth who are starting to contribute. Started collaborating, had some conversations with some of the folks at Google who are thinking about similar things. Mm-hmm. I think it's really, this is literally like in the last month. So
right.
It's forming
it's
up.
Really
fresh.
Really fresh.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's one of those critical pieces, isn't it? I mean, if a CIO is going to be like, you're going to go talk to CIO, they're going to ask about policy probably in the first 10 minutes.
They're pretty nervous, right? Yeah. I mean, I think that like going to cloud was nervous enough because like the servers left and they couldn't walk up and down the server rack aisle. Yeah. And now this container thing, and they, all their CMDB and all of the existing tooling like just don't apply, and it makes them a little nervous. And this, I think, provides a lot of reassurance where you can say, no, you know what, we can provide you with ways to put rules. And it's important, right? If you're in a financial industry, this stuff's important. Right? This could be the difference between, user data out on the internet and a secure system, right? Like that you can understand why they're nervous about it.
So if you're going to look forward to 2019 and with 2018 in retrospective, will this be a major focus for you, and how would it rank in comparison to other aspects of the projects that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's sort of a tripod. For Azure and Kubernetes, there's sort of this tripod of things that we focus on. One is just the core service. Have to make it, have to make sure that it is delivering core Kubernetes. The other is these kinds of enterprise features, right? I mean, Azure is an enterprise cloud. That's our sweet spot. That's the place where we're focused. And bringing the tooling to enable them with their digital transformation is really, really important, and to be comfortable with their digital transformation. And then the last piece, the last focus is developers and developer tooling. That's where Helm and the Visual Studio Code integration and a bunch of other work goes, where we have a really rich history at Microsoft in developers and in editors and building, honestly, still the best IDEs on the planet. Being able to make the enterprise line developer successful inside of Kubernetes, that requires building really great tooling, and that's the other area of focus for us, and we'll continue through 2019. I think what's important is we're doing it out in the community. It's not, these are all open source projects that we work on with a wide variety of people. It's not just focused on Azure, but obviously we think a lot about our customers and want to deliver value to them.
And building community is a big theme here, and for the China event, and that seems to be kind of the critical factor for a market like China, where if you look at the numbers that they were presenting earlier, there's dozens of certified service providers. There's a good percentage of them from China, but the end user base in China is relatively small in comparison.
Yeah.
So this has to be a focus for you in the new
year.
No,
it really is, and actually we're really excited. Later today, we're going to be announcing the availability of the Azure Kubernetes service in Azure's China Cloud. It's a really important market for Azure. It's a great place so that you can achieve, a lot of companies we talk to, they have a global footprint, right? And the Chinese market is a very important market in gaming, in all kinds of other industries. And being able to use Azure both around the world and in China, to use Kubernetes to be able to deploy into all these environments becomes really incredibly important to them. So that's a exciting announcement that we have for later today. So.
Brendan, we're hearing the loudspeakers, so maybe this is the time where we can finish this conversation. But thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Alex. It's always a pleasure.
Great. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
This episode of the New Stack Makers is sponsored by KubeCon CloudNativeCon. KubeCon CloudNativeCon conferences gather adopters and technologists to further the education and advancement of cloud-native computing. The vendor-neutral events feature domain experts and key maintainers behind popular projects such as Kubernetes, Prometheus, gRPC, Envoy, and more. The KubeCon Seattle event is coming right up, December 10th through 13th. It is sold out. You can still get on the waiting list. Registration will open soon for their 2019 events. Be sure to register early for KubeCon Barcelona, May 20th through 23rd, KubeCon Shanghai, June 24th through 26th, and KubeCon San Diego, November 18th through 21. Hope to see you there. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.